Hey everyone, and welcome back to another lesson. Today we are going to be looking at the lesson, The Wilderness to Land, as we follow along with the Israelites during the period of their history known as the Wilderness Wanderings. Now we are going to cover a pretty healthy chunk of the biblical narrative today, like a large batch of the Old Testament narrative, even though we don't actually cover that much space in terms of like history. We're covering a big batch of it. Now, the first thing that I'm going to want you to do here in just a second is put me on pause and do our normal time of sharing together with your families, your highs and lows, the things that have been going good this week, the things that maybe haven't been going so great this week, and then share together in the prayer. And I will have the prayer included in the email that I send you guys as well, just like we did last time. I think that kind of works a little bit better, so we'll do it that way. As I mentioned, we're going to cover a lot of space in terms of the scriptures. Now, the first 5 books of the Bible, which include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is called the Pentateuch. Pentateuch means 5, like pentagram, 5 books. So the first 5 books of the Bible. We're also going to be covering Joshua, which is book number 6, but for whatever reason in their reckoning, that's kind of considered separate from those other first 5. So that is what we're going to cover. And if you look, you can see this portion that I've got marked with my pen up to here. That is the multitude of the Pentateuch, the first 5, as well as the book of Joshua. So lots and lots and lots of ground. Now, we've already been through Genesis. We spent several weeks there as we were talking about the creation story and the fall, and then the various patriarchs. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry, my brain went blank for a second there. And we've also gone on through about the first half of the book of Exodus. That's what we looked at last week as we looked at Moses and his life, and then the encounter with the Egyptians and trying to set the Israelites free from slavery, and the 10 plagues and all of that. Now, we left off with things right after Moses and the Israelites had gone through the Red Sea, and God had miraculously parted the Red Sea. They went through, and then God brought the water back, and all the Pharaoh and all the Egyptians, they all drowned. So that's kind of where we left off. To give a little bit more of thought process about what is going on here in the Pentateuch in these different groups or these different batches. Through the back half of Exodus, kind of right after we left off from last week, we spend some time wandering in the wilderness, and we hear quite a bit about that. And also God gives instructions for creating something called the Tabernacle. Now, the Tabernacle was a special tent that they constructed, and it was always set up in the midst of all the people, and the tent or the tabernacle was where God would dwell. The presence of God was dwelling among the people, and they have really big detailed instructions for how to create that. So that's kind of the back half of the book of Exodus. From there, we've got Leviticus and Numbers. Those are the next 2 books, and there are some narrative aspects of those 2 books, but mainly Leviticus is a big rule book, and then Numbers is essentially a big census. Like they kind of figure out like how many people are there and who are the people and all that. So that's the main thrust of those 2 books, even though there are some small narrative aspects to it. Now, Deuteronomy actually has quite a bit in common with Leviticus. We hear a lot of the rules laid out again, but it's also it's an address that Moses is giving to the people, and it's like way later. It's like at the end of that 40 years, whereas Leviticus is closer to the beginning of it. So even though there's a lot of similarities between the 2, in fact, almost verbatim in certain cases, they happen like 40-ish years apart. So that's kind of what's going on in there. Now, as I mentioned, we left off with Moses and the people having just come through the Red Sea and witnessed that miraculous event that God provided. Now, after this, Moses and the people, they sing a song of praise to God about what they have done. Now, this is found in Exodus 15, verses 1 through 18. Now, I want you to go ahead and read that. So put me on pause, go ahead and read that. Lovely, right? There's some good stuff in there. Things like them saying, I will sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed, and the Lord is my strength, and the Lord is my might. There's some maybe not quite so nice stuff like Pharaoh's chariots. God has cast into the sea, and the floods covered them. And then there's some weird stuff in there too. You might have picked up on this. At the blast of your nostrils, the water has piled up. Ew, the blast of God's nostrils. So God like basically blew his nose at the Red Sea. That's strange, right? But that's the imagery that they used. Essentially, this song is based on the observations of Moses and the people. They recognize what God has done for them. They recognize that God has freed them, that God has done amazing things. They worship God, and everything is great for about 3 days. 3 days later, they've been in the desert. Now they're thirsty, and they grumble. And of course, they grumble to their leaders, and that's Moses. And sometimes we hear about them grumbling to Aaron as well, Moses' brother, if you remember that. Moses then grumbles to God because gripes always go uphill, and God provides water for them. Now, this happens this time. It also happens at other times as well. But that's one situation where they have a need, a physical need, and because of that, they grumble. They start to get really whiny and complainy, and then God provides for them. From here, we're going to zip forward like 6 weeks in terms of history. And I want you to read Exodus 16, verses 1 through 3. Nice short little reading. So go ahead and read that. The people are basically now complaining because things are getting hard. And they're like, remember how great it was when we were in Egypt? We had all the food we wanted, and all we had to do was be slaves and make bricks all day, every day. Wasn't it great? I always say that the people have really short memories, and that seems to be the case here. Once again, they gripe to Moses and they gripe to Aaron, who then they gripe to God because gripes always go uphill. Now, I want you to read verses 4 through 15. This is God's response. God responds, I'm going to give you manna, like this special bread that they find every day. And I'm also going to give you meat because they complain that they want some meat. And they're like, I'm going to give you so much meat, it comes out of your nostrils. Ew, right? What is this with like God blowing his nose or food coming out their nostrils? I don't know. Weird. They seem to have a thing about noses, but there you go. Question for you, and I want you to record this, talk about this, and write this down. Why do you think the people so quickly forget about all that God has done for them? Like, why do they start to complain so quickly? Okay, as time goes on, they keep complaining. God keeps providing for them on and on and on. And God continues to show great, great patience with the people, even though they seem to complain like all of the time. And this happens right up to the point when they finally approach the promised land. Now, remember, God said, I'm going to take you out of Egypt, and I'm going to take you to the promised land, something we sometimes hear called Canaan, or we call it the Holy Land at times, all of these different names. But this promised land, promised way back to Abraham, if you remember, God brings them to there. Now, when they're approaching it, Moses wants to kind of get the lay of the land. Like, what can we expect there? So he sends out 12 spies. 2 of them are Caleb and Joshua. Those are important names. But he sends out 12 spies to go scope things out and kind of see, well, what are we up against? What can we expect? Now, Caleb and Joshua, they bring back a favorable report. Like, this is great. The land is wonderful. We should go in and take it. And God has promised to be with us. But the other ones, they're kind of scared because they see a lot of armies, they see a lot of people, and they don't really want to go in battle. So they start spreading lies. They're like, there were armies of giants. We're like grasshoppers to them. We shouldn't do it. We're scared. Let's not go. So they spread all these sort of false reports. And with that, the people all listen to the false reports. So they keep grumbling. They're still thinking, oh, we should go back to Egypt. Remember how great it was in Egypt. God gets really irritated with them. And he says, fine. You don't want to go you don't want to go in, you want to complain. I'm going to have you wander in the wilderness until you all die, and I'll give the promised land to your children. And that is exactly what happens. 40 years go by. They wander in the wilderness, they wander around, they live in their tents, they have no settled place to live for 40 years until almost everyone dies off. Moses is still around, but now, hey, he's like 120 years old now, so he's been around for a while. And Caleb and Joshua are both still alive too. Everyone else has died off. Everyone from that previous generation has died off. Now, at this point, Moses stands up to address the people. He knows he's about to die. God has told him that. And so he wants to remind them of their history. Because remember, now this is a brand new generation. They weren't around when the Exodus had all happened. They hadn't witnessed all of that. So he gives them their history, and he also gives them a lot of instructions. He goes over those things that they had talked about in Leviticus. Now, this is pretty much the entire book of Deuteronomy. That's where that comes from. Okay, let's see. Now, at this point, once this is all done, or this whole thing has happened, at the end of Moses' time as leader. Now, he had been a good, faithful leader in directing the people, but he's not perfect by any means. He whined at God a lot. He complained a lot. We have a lot of examples of that. And also, the big issue that God really seemed to take issue with is Moses takes credit for one of those times when God provided water. He's telling them, who provided water for you in the wilderness? I did. Not, hey, God provided for you. I did. So God takes issue with that and basically tells Moses, because you took credit for what I did, you will see the promised land, but you will not enter it. And so Moses knows this, and then we hear about it. Now, I want you to read at the end of Deuteronomy. Look up Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 through 5. Go ahead and read that. We see that God gives Moses this peak. He gets to look across the river from the mountains and see the promised land, and then he dies. Bummer. Now, at this point, Joshua, one of the two spies, one of them that had given the good report 40 years in advance, he's also been Moses' longtime assistant. He's been around helping Moses for a long, long, long time. He takes over as the leader now. Moses' brother Aaron has already died. Now Joshua becomes the leader of the people. Now he takes this new generation. They cross the Jordan River from the wilderness and they go into the promised land. Over the course of quite a long time, they clear out a lot of the people who had already lived there. Namely, there's a whole lot of fighting, and this is all going on in the book of Joshua, named after Joshua, of course. And then towards the end of his life, he's not gonna die, but it's pretty much right at the end of the book of Joshua. He stands up, and just like Moses had a generation before, he gives this big old long address to the people, again reminding them of their history, reminding them of all that God has done for them, and so he's talking to the people. Now, he's not quite as long-winded as Moses was, but he still talks for a while. I want you to read Joshua 24, verses 14 through 18. Now, at this point in this whole address, he's basically saying you have a choice that lies before you now. You can choose to serve the gods of the people who we're going to go in and take over, or the people that you've been around, or you can serve the one who has been faithful to us. And he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Both Moses and Joshua, both of these two leaders, they have left long-standing impressions on the Jewish culture. They were both very, very important. Moses probably considered a little bit more than Joshua, but Joshua is very important as well. At this point, I want you to back up from Joshua back to Deuteronomy. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, and go ahead and read that. This is kind of almost like a creed or a statement of belief. It's called the Shema. That's what the name of it is. And this is recited daily by Jewish people, even now, still today, many thousands of years later, it's still recited by Jewish people today. Now, there is a very, very strong connection between this passage, the Shema, and some of Jesus' teachings when we get into the Gospels and into the New Testament. Because remember, Jesus was Jewish, so he would have been affected. He would have known the Shema, this creed, this statement. He would have used it as well. Now, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke, all three of them feature a time when Jesus is being questioned about what is the greatest commandment. And he actually says something that's very, very similar to this. Now, you can find this. I want you to look this up. We're going to zip up to the New Testament now. Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. So go ahead and read that. Okay, now here's a question. How is this response of Jesus in that similar to the Shema from Deuteronomy, and how is it different? So go ahead and talk about that and record that. And now another question, what do you think Jesus means when he says, on these two commandments stand all of the law and the prophets? What might he be talking about? Why might he think that? So no wrong answers, just go ahead and record what you think. All right. So today we've covered 40 odd years of nomadic history of the people. God makes a lot of promises to be with them, to dwell in their midst, and to provide for them. God is faithful to these promises. God also sets some boundaries for them. And the purpose of these boundaries is so that their culture will serve as an example for how we can live in harmony with one another. Now, if you think clear back to the promise that God made to Abraham way back when, all the nations of the earth will be blessed by you. I think this is all part of what God is up to in moving all of this forward. Now, the basis for these boundaries are the 10 Commandments, and that is what we are actually going to focus in on next week. So that's a little bit of a preview for a week from now. As we wrap up today, we covered a lot of ground, I know. I spoke a lot. I talked a lot. We didn't necessarily read that much, but there's a lot of history in there. So of all of this, what do you think is the most dramatic part? And what do you think is the weirdest thing that we talked about today? Does it seem like good news to you, or maybe not? Go ahead and record all that. And also, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments, go ahead and include those as well. Thanks, everybody. We will catch you next time.